One of the most comforting passages in all of the scripture that I often find myself turning to, and actually we're studying this in our men's Bible study at the moment, is 1 Thessalonians. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, Paul writes to this young, new church with these young Christians, and it's about what happens when we die. He says to them, brothers and sisters, we do not want you to be ignorant about those who fall asleep, or to grieve like the rest of men who have no hope. We believe that Jesus died and rose again, and so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him, those who have died in him. As Christians, it's not that we don't grieve, we do grieve, but we don't grieve like the rest of the world without hope. Our trust in the gospel, our certainty of salvation, God's promise of forgiveness means that we grieve with hope. And I really do believe that there is a difference between grieving and knowing God and grieving and not knowing God. I think that as we go backwards now into the book of Job, there is a difference between suffering with hope and suffering with no hope. And this passage just gives us a glimmer into what it means to suffer with hope. We've gone for 37 chapters in the book of Job, and Job has been questioning all along. He's been driven to asking all kinds of questions. Others, his so-called friends, have had their say about these questions. They've raised answers. We've listened to them. They have brought their collective wisdom to bear on the matter of why Job has gone through such intense, horrific suffering. Plenty of things have been said, and yet at the end of it all, we're still left, Job is still left asking the question, my God, and that's important, my God, there is still that personal cry, my God, why? After all, Job has suffered as much as anyone has ever suffered in the whole history of this world. Now, certainly there have been plenty of things that we have learned along the way about Job and suffering. We've learned from him as he has struggled. We've learned what it looks like to struggle and suffer with a relationship with God. We've learned from this man what it looks like to fear God and to shun evil. We've seen wisdom. And yet we're still left at the end of 37 chapters agonizing over this question of, my God, why? What is the answer to that question? And now we come to Job 38. And for the first time in the whole story, the Lord speaks. Job chapter 38 and verse 1. Then the Lord answered Job out of the storm. This is the moment that Job has been waiting for. This is the moment he's been hoping for. If you followed along in this series, this is the moment that you have been waiting for and the moment that you have been hoping for. That finally the Lord will give some answers to the question of suffering in this world. That finally we'll get some light shed on the question of, my God, why? It's important to note in the very beginning of this that the Lord answered Job. And if you look carefully in your Bibles, it's the Lord spelled in all capitals. That is the name of the covenant God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the name that God gave to Moses at the burning bush. This is a God who desires to have a relationship with his people. I could say a lot more about that. It's fascinating that it appears here in the book of Job, because there's every possibility that the story of Job happens before the nation of Israel is formed and put into place. But it's important to note that this is the covenant God, the promise-making God of the Old Testament who now speaks and answers Job. You will be disappointed to note that the answers that he gives come in the form of questions. Have you ever dealt with a person like that? You ask them questions and they answer your questions with questions. Well, that's what's going to happen here now. It's also important, finally, to note that at this moment, like other extraordinary events that took place in world history that are recorded in the Bible, like the prophets in the Old Testament, Job heard the voice of God. This is actually God speaking to Job. And so on one level, it's a pity that we're only taking 25 minutes and one Sunday to look at these 3-4 chapters where it's actually God's very words. In all likelihood, this is the longest speech that we have recorded by God in the whole of the Old Testament. And so I would encourage you to please go home and spend today and this week rereading Job 38 to 41, because these really are God's words spoken from out of the storm to Job. Like God spoke to Moses at the burning bush, or Israel at Sinai, or Isaiah in the temple, or Elijah in the wilderness, or Ezekiel in Babylon, so God here speaks to Job. And this is one of the great occasions in the whole Old Testament, in the whole of world history. And so we begin to listen. Verse 2. God speaking out of the storm. Who is it that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man, and I will question you, and you shall answer me. Job had found himself questioning God's governance of the world. Of course, that happens when suffering strikes us, when tragedy comes, when the things that we hadn't anticipated happening to us happen to us, when the bottom falls out of our world, when we become grief-stricken and are weeping on the floor. We question God's governance of the world, and we ask, why, God? Why are you doing this? But if Job and us, by implication, really want answers to these questions, the very first thing that we have to recognize is the questions that we ask are ignorant questions. The question, why, God, is a question that lacks knowledge. That's why God says to Job, who is it that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man, Job, and I will question you, and you shall give me your answers. Job was not illuminating things with his questions. You know, we often think as human beings and as individuals, we're quite clever. We come up with very clever questions. We're quite creative in the things that we ask. And what God is here saying to Job is actually, Job, you're not bringing any illumination. You're actually just bringing more darkness. You know, there are times when people have horrible things happen to them, when suffering strikes. And what you begin to see happen is that they begin to ask their questions with arrogance. The darkness of their situation begins to darken their minds. And they ask their questions because they've suffered so much, because they have so much life experience. It'll go something like this. You'll be speaking to somebody about the goodness of God. And that person will turn to you and you say, you know nothing. God's not good. Let me tell you about my life and the things that I've experienced. They've learned so much about the world and the reality of the life that they've lived because of their suffering. And they have all these things to say, and they have all these questions to ask, but it doesn't illuminate or bring light to the reality of the world that we live in and the reality of the God who created this world and runs this world. And so God says to Job, firstly, you need to understand that your questions are not making the situation any better. You think that they're clever and they're wise, but in actual fact, they're foolish. Now, it's not to say, and let me just be clear on this, it's not to say that God doesn't understand why Job is asking them. And that's also not to say that God doesn't care. He does care. And he does understand why Job's asking them. But for Job and for us, we need to understand that in that moment, those questions are actually ignorant questions. Because there are bigger things that are going on that if we're going to deal with our suffering, we need to understand. So God says, I'm going to ask the questions. You're going to answer them. One of the difficulties that we have with reading Job 38 to 41, and Janina Lindsay actually did a great job in doing it, is that we don't quite know the tone that God is using. You know, if God is yelling at Job, then that kind of puts these questions in one way. I don't think that he is, though, because I don't think that's the pattern that we see in the whole book of Job and in the whole of the Bible. I don't think that what we're hearing is God running a list of Job's failings and crushing Job and telling Job what a terrible, awful person that he is. I think the friends were like that back in chapter 4 to 27, but God doesn't ever seem to be like that. God doesn't deal with Job like that. God is taking Job seriously. And I think that really does make a difference. More learned men than I am, including some famous dead men, have suggested that the tone that is being used here is a sort of kindly playfulness, as the Lord speaks to Job in a very relaxing way, not to crush him with an awareness of his minuteness, contrasted with the limitless power of God. Not to mock him when he puts his tiny mind alongside God's vast intellect. On the contrary, the mere fact that God is conversing with him shows a dignity that Job and human beings have above all the birds and the beasts, assuring him that he is worthy of being addressed by God. So Job, brace yourself, and let me ask you the questions. Verse 4, where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together, and all the angels shouted for joy. The most puzzling thing that God says in the speeches in these last 4 chapters is that God never talks to Job about what Job is talking about. God answers Job with a series of questions in order to raise Job's gaze up from what he's going through to understand that there are bigger things that are taking place and that are going on in this world. He doesn't speak to Job about his suffering. He says, where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Were you there? Did you hear the song of the angels, their joy as they saw the cosmos come into being? Did you take a great part in the building and the establishment of the universe, Job? You've got to say, well, why is God saying these things? And you get to verse 8. Who shut up the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness? When I fixed limits for it and set its doors and bars in place? When I said, this far you may come and no further, here is where your proud waves halt. Now in the Bible, the sea frequently represents the forces of chaos and destruction and things going wrong. The implication in verses 8 to 11 that God is making is who sets the limits for the forces of destruction? Who says to chaos, you can come this far, but you cannot come any further? Who was it that decided that the waves at Musenberg Beach could get that far, but they couldn't come over? Not the city officials, not the town planner, not Job, God. It's also a reminder to us, I think, to chapters 1 and 2. Do you remember chapter 1 and 2? The Satan comes, and God says, what about my servant Job? And Job says, oh no, he only trusts you because of what he can get out of you. And God says, well, I'll hand him over to you, but you may do this, but you may go no further. You may not strike him ill. And then in chapter 2, you may not take his life. God sets the limits of suffering and destruction and chaos. In the whole scope of creation. But again, why is God speaking to Job like this? It raises more questions than it answers. Verse 12, have you ever given orders to the morning or shown the dawn its place, that it might take the earth by the edges and shake the wicked out of it? The earth takes its shape like clay under a seal. Its features stand out like those of a garment. The wicked are denied their lights, and their unpraised arm is broken. Okay, so we've got more biblical imagery. Now we've got the darkness and the light. It really is a magnificent poem that you do need to give your mind and your attention and meditate on. But the biblical imagery of darkness doesn't just mean darkness. I mean, it was dark this morning. I was up early, and it was dark until late. I mean, at 7:15, it was still dark. I was like, where is the sun? Can you please come up? At about 6:45, I was like, can you please come up? I was busy working on this and going, it doesn't matter if I want the sun to come up. It doesn't matter if I tell the sun to come up. I can't say to God, make the sun. The sun comes up when God says the sun will come up. But the darkness isn't just the darkness like that. The darkness points to the cover under which men and women do evil. You can go read more about that in 1 and 2 and 3 John. It says, Job, have you ever been the one to order the morning, to say to the dawn, now you can come? Are you the one who does that day after day, night after night? Verse 16, Job, have you journeyed to the springs of the sea? Have you walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been shown to you? Have you seen the gates of deepest darkness? Have you comprehended the vast expanses of the earth? Tell me if you know all this. In all of Job's suffering, he thought that he had seen death. He thought that he had been to the gates of hell. That's what it's like when you suffer, when you really suffer. When tragedy comes, you feel that as though you've looked death in the face and you've seen death looking back at you. But you see, no matter what you've been through, no matter what I've been through, no matter what Job has been through, when God asks the question, have you really seen the vast expanses of creation? Do you think that in all the suffering that you have been through, you have really been to the very depths of everything? And you suddenly, I think, as you get to verse 18, you begin to, if you haven't already, you start to feel quite small. And you're still asking yourself, why is God saying these things to Job? You know, if someone was suffering, I wouldn't say these things to them. I would try and tell them things like, it's all going to be okay. Or, I'm sure that there's some kind of purpose in this, but God never goes there. And there's something in there for us to think about when we do comfort and when we do suffer. And so we carry on asking, why is God saying these sorts of things to Job? I think as he asks these questions, I'll get to this in a second. Verse 19. As he asks these questions, we do need to feel something of the impact and the force of them. What is the way to the abode of life? Verse 19. Can you take them to their places? Do you know the paths to their dwellings? Verse 21. This is what I'll illustrate this. Surely you know, for you were already born. You've lived so many years. It's like when you kind of get a little bit sarky with a child because they're kind of acting out like they know this stuff, and you're like, oh, okay, well, why don't you do it? Why don't you try it? Let's see how far you get with that. You obviously know better than I do. Yeah, you get what's happening there. You know, he's saying to Job in verse 19, he's going, hey, Job, you know, you're so old. Surely you remember the beginning, all that time ago, when I put light in darkness. Because you've been around so long, you've experienced so much. Why don't you tell us where the light and the darkness come from, Job? Because you obviously know how it works. Verse 22, have you entered the storehouses of the snow? Verse 24, what is the way to the place from where the lightning is dispersed? Verse 25, who cuts the channel for the torrents of rain? Verse 28, does the rain have a father? Who fathers the drops of dew? Verse 29, from whose womb comes the ice? Verse 32, can you bring forth the constellations in their seasons? Can you lead the bear out with its cubs? Can you raise the voice of the clouds? It's basically 4 chapters that just go on and on and on like this, asking these questions over and over and over. Basically, you want me to summarize it executively, like elevator pitch? Hey, Job, how do you think you would do if you were running the show? How would you do if you were ruling over the world? Would you like to try and keep the stars in their place? Would you like to try and control the weather patterns across the vast earth? Carries on in chapter 39, 40, 41. Just more and more of the same. So what's the point of all this? Well, there's a little break in chapter 40, verses 1 and 2. The Lord said to Job, will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? Let him who accuses God answer him. Now, either we have here the most massive put down and putting into place Job, with the great, almighty, and all-powerful God of the universe saying to him, get back in line, I'm running the show, don't you dare question me. Or, and this is what I think is the case, God is responding to Job's questions. He's not answering them, but he is responding to them with the answers that they need. And he is doing that by teaching him what he actually needs to understand if he's going to cope with his suffering. You see, one of the great problems that we have when we suffer is that our horizons shrink in all around us. And all that we can see is myself and my pain and myself and my loss and myself and my grief, and I can see nothing else. And my questions arise out of this tiny, tiny world that I have created. A terrible world to be in, but a terrible world to ask questions from. And one of the reasons that we find it so difficult to approach a person who is suffering is that we're so aware of the world that they are living in and the world that we are not in that moment. There's a barrier around them. I don't know if you've ever felt that when you try to go and speak to someone who's suffering, and because they're going through something so specific and particular, you're really not sure what to say or how to engage with them. You don't know how to sit next to them. Because the thing that they are going through is worlds apart from what you're going through, and their pain and their experience is beyond what you can understand, and that's what it's like for Job. And so the question of the sufferer who is suffering this pain is why? But it is born out of me, me, me. And the only way that it can be dealt with, and the only way that it can be coped with. And I'm mindful that sitting in this room, there are people who are suffering. And I'm mindful that sitting in this room, there are people who are trying to help those who are suffering. But what we learn from God as he deals with Job is that the only way that suffering can be dealt with is by lifting the eyes of the sufferer away from their suffering and to the Lord. The sufferer has to learn, and this is the hardest thing I'm going to say in this whole sermon. The sufferer has to learn that he or she may never understand why they are suffering. Job never found out why he was suffering. God never told Job what we read back in chapter 1 and 2. He never knew about that exchange that took place in heaven between God and the Satan. And so we should be very, very careful when we say to people, it's all going to be okay. Because you know something, it might not be. And we should be very, very careful to say that this, I'm sure that this is happening for a reason. Because it might not be happening for any reason whatsoever. We have to learn to be at peace that we may never understand why we are suffering. And that is the truth. But what God did teach him is that there are many, many things about God ruling his universe that you and I and Job do not understand. That's the point of all these questions. Do you understand them? I certainly don't, but God does. And the question that has to be put ever so gently, alongside you might not ever understand why you're suffering. This is the second hardest thing I want to say in this sermon. The question that has to be put ever so gently is, does it really matter that you do not understand everything? Do you really have to know why? I inadvertently did this the other day. One of our cars isn't working. We had to borrow a Des's car, and I got into the car with Kira, and in the car was the key to the car that wasn't working. And I spent an entire drive to Claremont saying to Kira, "What is this key doing in the car? How did this key get into this car?" I obsessed over this key sitting in the car. What is it doing here? How did it get here? I drove her absolutely nuts. I completely exasperated my daughter. And eventually she said, "Dad, what?" I said, "Kira, I just have to know why. Why is this key here?" I mean, it's silly and it's stupid. But we can do that. We can obsess. Why? We become so obsessed with why, and we actually need to understand that, something? It doesn't actually always matter why. The key certainly didn't matter why, but something? Sometimes the why of your suffering doesn't matter either. We don't always have to understand everything. And so, chapter 40, verse 3, Job answers the Lord, "I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer." When Job says he's unworthy there in verse 4, he's really saying, the word means small. So he's saying, I am small. I get that now. How can I reply to you? That is what he has come to understand and perceive. That is what he now recognizes, that in his own person and in the world that he lives in, he is really small in God's huge world and creation. That he has no answers to give to God. And he's coming to realize that there are many, many things that he just doesn't understand. And then, chapter 40, verse 6, the Lord speaks to Job out of the storm again, and it's more of the same. But what was happening is that God is giving Job the help that he needs. It's firm help. It's not sentimental help. But he's not giving him unreality. He's not giving him a desperate answer to his suffering. He's dealing with Job right through to the end of chapter 41 in such a way that Job is really helped. That Job is actually helped. And next week, Job's going to respond, but that's next week. We'll look at chapter 42 next week. But let me wrap all of this up for us with a couple of application points. Sometimes people think that in order for them to get to the depth and the bottom of their suffering, they need to also have a personal encounter with God. And I want to tell you that that's not true. You don't need to have a personal encounter with God like Job had a personal encounter with God. God spoke to Job, and we ought to hear that and take that to heart. Because by speaking to Job, he speaks to us. We ought to realize that the one who spoke in the Old Testament like this to the prophets, Hebrews chapter 1, in the past, God spoke to our ancestors, to the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom also he made the universe. We need to realize that God does speak to us today, albeit in a different way than he spoke to Job on that day from out of the storm. So that as you experience suffering, do not forget that the great God of the universe, the creator of all things, the Lord of promise and covenant, has spoken also to us. And he has spoken to us not just about his vast rule over creation, and not just about how much we don't understand, but also about his love in redeeming that creation. Not just about his power, but about his power and his care for us, in his sending his Son to die in our place and opening up a way to life forever. The answer to our suffering is not something that comes to us easily, and in most cases, it's not something that comes to us quickly. I mean, look how long it took Job, 41 chapters, for him to finally understand the suffering. Not the why necessarily of it, but to understand it in its context of his relationship with God and living in this world. But just because it doesn't come quickly or easily, the answer is the same. It involves lifting our eyes and seeing beyond our little world that we have become trapped in. It involves us seeing the great God who is in control of all things, and who loved the world so much that he sent his Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish but have eternal life. I couldn't get away from the warning in Hebrews chapter 2 that we must pay the most careful attention to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away. Our suffering will cause us to drift away from God. You know, that was the whole thing in the book of Job. Not in Job's speech, what God said to him, but in the thing of the book of Job is that Satan was trying to discredit Job's faith and brought suffering and destruction into his life so that he would curse God, so that he would drift away. You know, we're in danger of that very thing, of ignoring such a great salvation that is on offer to us because we become so caught up in our tiny, tiny little world. Understanding our suffering involves seeing the great God who is in control of all things. It involves lifting our eyes and seeing the great things of God that we do not and cannot understand at all, and then responding to God's invitation, which is, I'm asking you to trust me, even in what you're going through now. I'm asking you to trust me. So the writer of the Psalms quoted in the book of Hebrews, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. If you find yourself in the midst of suffering and you're drifting and your heart is becoming hard towards the Lord, he's coming to you today and saying, trust me. Just trust me. I can't give you the answers to the why of your suffering, but if you trust me, I will walk through that suffering with you into eternity. And so let me ask you today, will you trust him? Will you trust him with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength? Will you hear his word to you today, to despite of circumstances, to keep following him, or perhaps for the first time, to put your trust in him?